It was an ordinary Tuesday, or so I thought, the kind of day where everything seemed to fall into place. The cases I had been handling in court had progressed smoothly, and the administrative paperwork on my desk was finally under control. I had just wrapped up a long series of back-to-back meetings, the kind that always left me feeling mentally drained, but also accomplished. The pressure of the federal case I was working on weighed heavily on my shoulders, yet it was the kind of challenge I thrived on. As the clock ticked past 5 p.m., I felt a strange sense of relief, looking forward to unwinding for the evening. My wife, Sarah, was due to get home soon, and we had planned a quiet dinner together, something I had been craving after the hectic day I had just experienced. Sarah, who was 8 months pregnant with our first child, had just finished her doctor's appointment. She had been telling me about it all morning, her excitement about seeing the baby on the ultrasound and hearing the heartbeat. As a first-time father, I was equally eager to experience every moment with her, and I was excited to get home and hear all the details. Her pregnancy had been smooth, and we were both full of anticipation, feeling that our lives were about to change forever. She had told me earlier that she would swing by the local store to grab a few groceries before heading home, something she often did in the evenings when I was busy with work. It was a quick trip, nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. I had just sat down at my desk for one last glance at my emails when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the call seemed urgent. I answered quickly, bracing myself for whatever was about to unfold. "Mr. Whitaker, is this Mr. Lucas Whitaker?" The voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is Lucas," I replied, my voice laced with a mix of curiosity and unease. I couldn't explain it, but something about the tone in the caller's voice sent a shiver down my spine. "This is Kevin from the parking lot at the Greenfield Plaza. I'm afraid there's been an incident involving your wife. She's been hit by a car." I felt my heart stop. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. What? What do you mean she's been hit? Is she okay? Where is she? What happened? I stammered, my voice a blur of panic and disbelief. "There was an accident. Your wife was struck by a vehicle in the parking lot. She's been taken to the emergency room, and we need you to come immediately. I'm afraid it doesn't look good." The words echoed in my ears as I rushed to grab my coat. My heart pounded in my chest, a rhythmic, frantic beat that drowned out all other sounds. I barely processed what Kevin had said, but the urgency in his voice was enough to tell me that this wasn't a simple fender bender or minor collision. My pregnant wife, had been struck down. I rushed out of my office, barely even saying goodbye to my colleagues, and ran to my car. As I sped through the streets of the city, my mind was a whirlwind of chaotic thoughts. How could this happen? Sarah was supposed to be safe. She was supposed to be heading home, nothing more than a routine trip. She had been fine when I spoke to her earlier. I could see her face in my mind, her radiant smile as she'd told me about the doctor's visit. She was so full of life, so vibrant, and the thought of something happening to her, let alone our unborn child, was unfathomable. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity, though it was only a matter of minutes. I couldn't stop imagining the worst, replaying the call over and over in my mind. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, as the world outside blurred by in a frantic rush. I wasn't even sure how I got there, but I somehow ended up in front of emergency room doors. The hospital was a blur as I ran inside, the sterile smell of antiseptic overwhelming my senses as I approached the receptionist. "I'm looking for Sarah Whitaker. She was brought in after an accident," I managed to say, breathless from the rush. My chest ached as I waited for the receptionist to respond, the seconds feeling like hours. The nurse gave me a quick, sympathetic glance before typing something into her computer. "She's in trauma. Please follow me." I didn't even think to ask questions. I followed her through the maze of sterile hallways, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the cold tile floors. My mind was spinning. What had happened to Sarah? Was she okay? And the baby? I couldn't even bring myself to consider the worst-case scenario. The thought of losing either of them was too much to bear. When I arrived at her bedside, the sight that greeted me was nothing like I expected. Sarah was unconscious, her pale face bathed in the harsh glow of the hospital lights. Her breathing was shallow, but steady, and I could see the gentle rise and fall of her chest as the monitors beeped rhythmically. But what struck me most was the silence. The usual hum of voices, the beeping machines, all faded into the background. All I could focus on was the figure lying before me. My wife, my love, in pain. A doctor approached me, his expression grave. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm Dr. Andrews. Your wife has suffered some serious injuries. She's been hit by a vehicle, and while she's stable for now, the next few hours are critical. We're doing everything we can, but I have to be honest with you. The situation is serious." My world seemed to crumble in that moment. The weight of the words, the gravity of the situation, crushed me. The doctor explained the extent of her injuries, broken bones, internal bleeding, and most shockingly, the loss of our baby. The words miscarriage and stillbirth were uttered, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I had to leave the room for a moment, the pain too raw to handle. It felt as if the entire world had collapsed around me, and nothing would ever be the same again. I leaned against the cold hospital wall, my hand clutching the railing for support as I tried to steady myself. It was then that I realized the true horror of what had happened. It wasn't just an accident, it was an act of recklessness. Sarah had been crossing the parking lot when a car, moving at an alarming speed, struck her with such force that it sent her sprawling to the ground. And the driver? The car didn't stop. As the days went on, I tried to piece together the puzzle. Who had done this to Sarah? Who had taken our baby away from us? And why didn't the driver stop? The questions gnawed at me relentlessly, but one thing became abundantly clear. This was just the beginning of something much bigger. I didn't know it yet, but the events that had just begun to unfold would shake me to my very core. The call came just as I had sat back in my office chair, letting the weight of the day's work settle on my shoulders. The kind of moment where you exhale, feeling like you might finally catch your breath. I was reflecting on how the day had unfolded, busy but manageable. A few more emails, a final review of a report, and I could finally go home. I was ready to embrace the quiet comfort of my home, where my wife, Sarah, 8 months pregnant, was already preparing for the arrival of our child. But the phone rang, disrupting my thoughts, and a strange anxiety hit me immediately. I glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, but there was no time to hesitate. I picked up the receiver, and the voice on the other end sent a shock through my chest. "Mr. Whitaker, is this Mr. Lucas Whitaker?" The voice on the other side was strained and nervous, a voice that made my gut twist with worry. "Yes, this is Lucas. What's going on? Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart was already beating faster in my chest. "This is Kevin from the parking lot at the Greenfield Plaza," the voice continued. "I'm afraid there's been an accident. Your wife, Sarah, she's been hit by a car. She's been taken to the hospital, and I need you to get here as soon as possible. It's bad, Mr. Whitaker. I'm afraid it doesn't look good." For a moment, the words didn't even register. My mind couldn't process the reality of what I had just heard. My wife hit by a car? I struggled to make sense of it. It was like someone had turned the world off and left me in a deafening silence. My thoughts scrambled for a response, but nothing came out. I could only focus on the one thing that made sense in the chaos. I needed to get to her. What happened? I finally managed to ask, trying to piece together the fragments of information that had barely reached me through the phone. "Is she okay? Where is she?" "She's in the emergency room now. They've taken her straight in. Please, Mr. Whitaker, you need to come." The ambulance is here, but the voice cracked, and I could hear the panic rising. "Please hurry." Before I could even ask more questions, the line went dead. I didn't wait. I grabbed my coat and raced out of my office, not even sparing a second to say goodbye to anyone. The world outside seemed to rush by in a blur as I sprinted to my car, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The short drive to the hospital felt like it lasted an eternity. Every second, every turn felt stretched and slow, and yet my heart was hammering in my chest with an urgency I couldn't shake. I could barely breathe as I thought of Sarah. I remembered the last time I saw her, the smile she had when she told me she was going to the store to pick up a few things. She had seemed so full of life, so ready for the future we had dreamed of together. Now, everything felt uncertain. My mind raced, bombarded with thoughts of what could have happened, of how she was, of what I was about to face. When I finally arrived at the hospital, I could hardly think straight. My feet moved without my brain telling them to, and I rushed past the reception desk, barely acknowledging the staff, who tried to stop me. They had to escort me back to the emergency room, where I could finally see Sarah. The scene in the trauma room was a blur. Doctors and nurses were rushing around, their voices filled with urgency, but nothing could prepare me for the sight of her. Sarah was lying there, unconscious, pale, and motionless. A silent terror gripped me as I approached her bedside. I couldn't hear the world around me. All I could hear was the pounding in my ears, the frantic rush of my heartbeat. The room smelled of antiseptic, and the sound of machines humming and beeping seemed to amplify my anxiety. Her body lay still, but I could see the bruises already forming on her delicate skin, the evidence of the impact. There were bandages wrapped around her head, her arms, her torso. She was hooked up to N4, and a respirator kept her breathing steady. But it was all mechanical, a lifelessness that chilled me to the bone. I couldn't move. My body felt numb, like I was watching this unfold from a distance, unable to truly comprehend the gravity of the situation. A doctor approached me, his expression serious, his tone somber. "Mr. Whitaker, I'm Dr. Williams. Your wife's injuries are severe. She's suffered multiple fractures, some internal bleeding, and a head injury. The trauma to her body is significant, but we've stabilized her for now. However, we need to be upfront with you. The next 24 hours are critical. We're doing everything we can, but she's in critical condition." I could barely process the words as they sank in. I felt the air leave my lungs, the weight of the situation pulling me down into a haze. The baby, the life we had been waiting for, was gone. There was no better way to say it. The dream I had built in my head, the joy I had felt when I found out we were going to be parents, was slipping through my fingers like sand. I wanted to scream, to shout out the injustice of it all, but instead, I stood there in silence. The numbness crept in deeper, making it impossible to move. My thoughts wandered to the car, the reckless driver who had done this. The driver had hit her, and then what? Did they stop? Did they help? Or did they just flee the scene? 1,000 questions bombarded me, but they felt irrelevant compared to what was happening right now. Nothing else mattered at that moment. Sarah mattered. Our baby mattered. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to leave her side. My mind couldn't stop racing. I wanted to scream, to ask for answers, to demand justice for the person who had taken so much from us. But all I could do was hold her hand and wait. Wait for the doctors to do their work. Wait for her to wake up. But as time passed, I realized that the more I waited, the less control I had over the situation. My wife was fighting for her life, and there was nothing more I could do. In the meantime, the police arrived. A uniformed officer came in, introducing himself as Officer Blake. "Mr. Whitaker, we're looking into the accident. Do you have any information on the car that hit your wife?" he asked. "We have a description, but we'll need your help." My heart sank again. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had made a decision. Someone had been careless. I tried to steady my breath as I remembered the call from Kevin, the store manager. "The car, I'm not sure who it was," I said, feeling the frustration building within me. "But I want to know who did this. I want to know why they didn't stop." The officer nodded, making notes on his notepad. "We'll find them, Mr. Whitaker. You have my word." But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy. This wasn't just a case of a random accident. This was a person, a driver who had caused this devastation and had shown no remorse. And the question that lingered in my mind was why? Why had they done this? Why had they taken everything from us. The hours that followed Sarah's admission to the hospital felt like a blur. The doctors were doing their best to stabilize her, working tirelessly, but I couldn't escape the gnawing ache of helplessness that settled deep in my chest. I spent what felt like an eternity in the sterile waiting room, waiting for updates that never seemed to come quickly enough. My mind refused to rest, endlessly replaying the accident over and over again. Who could do such a thing? Who could hit a woman 8 months pregnant and then just leave her there broken and vulnerable, as if she were nothing more than an obstacle to be discarded? The question burned in my mind, consuming me with anger and disbelief. I knew I needed answers, but I wasn't prepared for what I would find when I finally came face to face with the person responsible. It was nearly 2 hours later when I saw her. The police had arrived at the hospital, and I was informed that they had located the driver of the vehicle that hit Sarah. I was told to expect her to be brought in for questioning. My heart raced as I followed the officer through the hospital corridors. I didn't know what I was expecting, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality that awaited. There, standing by the officer in a small, plain room, was the woman who had caused this nightmare. She was tall, with an air of arrogance that was almost palpable. Her appearance was pristine, her clothes fashionable and well-maintained, as though she had just stepped out of an upscale boutique. She seemed out of place in the stark, clinical environment of the hospital. But what struck me most was her expression, cold, detached, almost smug. There was no remorse in her eyes, no hint of guilt. There was nothing that showed she had even the slightest understanding of what she had done. She looked up as I entered, her eyes locking onto mine with an unsettling indifference. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge the gravity of the situation. She merely crossed her arms over her chest, tilting her chin slightly upward as if she were daring me to say something. It was as though she didn't care. It was as if my wife's life and the life of our unborn child was of no consequence to her at all. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I felt an overwhelming urge to scream at her, to demand why she hadn't stopped, why she hadn't cared enough to help. But the words stuck in my throat, and I found myself paralyzed, staring at the woman who had so callously destroyed everything I had ever hoped for. "Are you the husband?" the officer asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, my jaw tight, barely able to form words. The officer looked at me, then at the woman, before speaking again. "We've questioned her, Mr. Whitaker. She's admitted to hitting your wife, but she doesn't seem to understand the severity of her actions." I looked back at the woman, my eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You don't understand? You hit my wife, a pregnant woman, and you don't understand the severity of your actions?" She shrugged, her expression still unreadable. "I didn't mean to hit her. It was an accident. I was late for an appointment, and I was distracted. I didn't even realize I had hit anyone until I saw her lying there. I didn't think it was that serious." Her words were like a slap in the face, each one colder and more infuriating than the last. An accident? She had hit my wife with enough force to send her sprawling to the ground, causing irreparable damage to both her body and our unborn child. And yet here she was standing in front of me, offering nothing but excuses. "I don't care if you were late for an appointment," I said through clenched teeth. "You don't just hit someone and walk away. You don't just leave them to die, and then act like it's no big deal." The officer stepped in trying to mediate, but I could barely hear him over the sound of my own rage. "Mr. Whitaker, please, we're gathering the facts. I understand this is difficult, but you need to remain calm." I couldn't remain calm. I couldn't stand the thought of this woman walking away without facing any consequences. I wanted to shake her, to make her understand the destruction she had caused. But instead, I forced myself to take a step back, to breathe deeply, to fight the fury that threatened to consume me. I turned to the officer. "Has she even expressed any remorse?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The officer exchanged a glance with the woman before answering. "Not really. She's given a statement, and she seems more concerned about the inconvenience this is causing her than the damage she's done." I felt a wave of disgust wash over me as I turned back to face the woman. She was still standing there, arms crossed, her posture so smug and unaffected that it almost seemed as though she was enjoying the chaos she had caused. "I don't care what your excuses are," I said, my voice rising with the intensity of my emotions. "You don't get to just walk away from this. You've taken everything from me. My wife is fighting for her life, and I don't know if she's going to make it. My child is gone, and you think you can just shrug this off?" She rolled her eyes as if I were the one being unreasonable. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said again, her voice cold and indifferent. "But I was late for my appointment, and I didn't see her. I'm not a bad person. I just made a mistake. I'm not sure why you're getting so upset." The officer looked at me, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation unfolding before him. "Mr. Whitaker, perhaps it's best if we step outside for a moment. We can discuss next steps." But I couldn't leave. I couldn't step away without confronting the woman who had wrecked my life so casually. "No," I said firmly. "I'm done. You can't just make excuses. You can't pretend like this isn't a big deal. What you've done is unforgivable." With that, I turned and walked away, refusing to let myself stay in the same room with her any longer. Every moment spent in her presence felt like an insult, a mockery of everything that had been taken from me. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. The moment I left the room, I was overwhelmed with a sense of hopelessness. I had never felt so powerless in my life. The woman who had taken everything from me stood there, unfazed, as though nothing had changed for her. It was like she had no idea that she had just shattered two lives. And the worst part was, she didn't care. It was a face of indifference, one I would never forget. The next few days passed in a haze of hospital visits, legal procedures, and sleepless nights. Sarah remained in critical condition, her body fighting against the damage caused by the impact. The doctors were doing their best to keep her stable, but every new update from them felt like a piece of bad news. She had fractured several bones, her internal injuries were severe, and though they had done everything possible, the road to recovery was uncertain. The most devastating blow, however, was the loss of our baby, the life we had dreamed of, now reduced to a painful void. I sat by her side, keeping vigil, whispering words of encouragement, and holding her hand as she lay unconscious. It felt as if the world outside had ceased to exist. My entire focus was on Sarah, on the woman I loved, and on the painful memories of the future we had planned together. I knew the coming weeks would be difficult, but I wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold. It was late on the third day, after the accident, when I received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was Officer Blake, the lead investigator on the case. He had been handling the investigation into the accident, and we had spoken several times over the past few days. But this time his tone was different. There was a sense of urgency, a quiet intensity that I hadn't heard before. "Mr. Whitaker," he began, "I need you to come down to the station. We've discovered something important. We need to talk." I could feel my stomach drop as 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. What could they have found? What was so urgent? I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my jacket and left the hospital, my mind swirling with unanswered questions. When I arrived at the police station, Officer Blake was waiting for me in the interrogation room. His expression was serious, but there was a sense of resolve in his eyes. He motioned for me to sit. "I've got something you need to see," he said, pulling a manila folder from his desk. "We've been going over the surveillance footage from the plaza parking lot, and I've got to tell you, it's not what we expected." He slid the folder across the table, and my heart raced as I opened it. Inside were photographs and printouts of the footage taken from the cameras outside the store. I could feel my pulse quicken as I began to look at the images. There she was, the woman who had struck Sarah. But there was something more. As I examined the footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footage showed her getting out of the car after the accident. She didn't rush to help. She didn't check on Sarah. Instead, she stood there for a moment looking around as though she were trying to figure out what to do. Then, in the blink of an eye, she turned and walked away, leaving Sarah lying in the parking lot, unmoving. But that wasn't the worst part. The footage also captured something I hadn't expected: a car parked nearby, a man in the driver's seat, watching the entire scene unfold. This man wasn't just a bystander. He was another part of the puzzle, someone I hadn't even considered. As the woman walked away, he did the same. They both seemed to walk in the same direction, as though they were in cahoots, as though they knew exactly what was happening. I stared at the footage, my mind racing. Was it possible that this wasn't just a random accident? Had this been planned? Was Sarah targeted? I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Officer Blake cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to the present. "We've identified the man in the car," he said. "He's someone you might know, Mr. Whitaker." I looked up confused. "What do you mean I might know him?" "The man in the car is Greg Langford," Blake continued. "He's a well-known member of the local homeowners association. In fact, he's heavily involved with the same group as the woman who hit your wife." My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. The homeowners association. The same group that had been a source of tension in the neighborhood for years. The same group where people like Karen, the woman who hit Sarah, ruled with an iron fist. I had heard rumors about corruption, about favoritism, but I never imagined it could go this far. Greg Langford. I repeated, the name feeling foreign in my mouth. But why would he be involved in this? What's his connection to the accident? Blake nodded grimly. "That's the question we're trying to answer. From what we've gathered, Langford and Karen have been working together for a while. They both seem to have a lot of influence in the neighborhood, and we're starting to see patterns that suggest this wasn't an accident. We think there may be more to this than just a simple hit and run." I could feel the anger rising in my chest. This wasn't just about a careless driver anymore. This was starting to look like something far more sinister. But I still didn't understand what the connection was. Why would they do this? What could they possibly gain from hurting Sarah and me? Blake seemed to read my confusion. We're still piecing things together, but it's clear that Karen and Langford have been using their positions of power for personal gain. We don't know yet if this accident was the result of something personal or if there's a deeper motive, but we're working on it. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the news. The woman who had struck Sarah wasn't just a careless driver, she was a part of something much bigger. And the man who had watched it all unfold was no bystander, he was complicit. The weight of the situation felt suffocating. My world had been shattered, and now I was realizing that the people who had destroyed it were part of a larger network of corruption and abuse of power. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What do we do next? Blake looked me in the eyes, his expression filled with determination. Now we bring them down. We'll keep investigating, and we'll make sure they answer for what they've done. But we need your help, Mr. Whitaker. We need you to stay involved. The more information we can gather, the stronger our case will be. I nodded slowly, my anger turning to resolve. I wasn't just going to let these people walk away from this. I wasn't going to let Sarah's suffering be in vain. This had gone from a personal tragedy to a fight for justice, a fight that would uncover the truth behind the accident and everything that had led up to it. But even as I left the station that day, I knew that the battle was far from over. The truth was out there, but so were the people responsible for destroying everything I held dear. And I would stop at nothing to make sure they paid for their actions. The days that followed the revelation about Karen and Greg Langford were filled with a quiet, simmering rage. What had started as a personal tragedy, a senseless act of violence against my wife, was slowly morphing into something much darker. The more I dug into Karen and Langford's background, the more I uncovered. The two weren't just ordinary people in the community, they were power players manipulating the system to their benefit. It wasn't just about the accident anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that lay at the heart of their actions. Karen's role in the local homeowners association, HOA, had always been one of dominance. She had built a reputation for being ruthless, for getting what she wanted, no matter the cost. From reports and rumors I gathered, it seemed she had been involved in countless shady dealings in the neighborhood. It wasn't uncommon for residents to find themselves at odds with her over minor issues, only to be met with disproportionate consequences. Whether it was unfair fines, illegal modifications to property rules, or forcing people out of their homes, Karen had found a way to use the HOA to control the lives of others. But it wasn't just Karen. Greg Langford, the man seen in the parking lot that day, had deep ties to the local political scene. He wasn't just a member of the HOA, he was a key figure in local elections, a man with connections that stretched into local government, law enforcement, and even the courts. What I had assumed to be a simple case of reckless driving was beginning to look more and more like a calculated, malicious act that was rooted in power and control. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that the accident wasn't just about me or Sarah. It wasn't even just about the loss of our unborn child. It was about a larger agenda, one where the lives of ordinary people were pawns in a game of greed and manipulation. And Sarah and I had unknowingly become a part of that game. I knew I had to act, but the reality of doing so was overwhelming. I couldn't take on a corrupt system alone. I needed help, and I needed to make sure that I was playing my cards carefully. I reached out to the police, but even that felt like a risk. After all, Langford's influence ran deep. The last thing I wanted was to tip off Karen or Langford that I was onto them, but I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I had to expose what they were doing, even if it meant putting myself in the crosshairs. The next step was a difficult one. I called in an old friend from law school, a seasoned investigator who had worked on high-profile corruption cases. His name was David Nash, and though he had left private practice years ago, I knew his skills were invaluable. When I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate for a second. "I'll be there in an hour," he said, his voice firm. "We'll dig into their backgrounds, get the evidence we need, and take them down. You're not doing this alone." David's arrival felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. He was a no-nonsense investigator with years of experience in uncovering hidden networks of corruption. The moment he stepped into my house, I could see the determination in his eyes. He immediately set to work, reviewing the evidence I had gathered, including the surveillance footage, police reports, and information about Karen and Langford's connections. "What's the end game here, Lucas?" he asked after a few hours of going through the documents. "Are we looking to charge them for the accident, or do you want to bring down the entire network?" I paused. The question hit me harder than I expected. The accident, the loss of my child, was just the beginning. But what had happened to Sarah wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the lives of countless others that had been ruined by people like Karen and Langford. I knew I had to bring the full weight of their actions to light. "We bring down the whole thing," I said, my voice filled with conviction. "We make sure they're held accountable, not just for the accident, but for everything they've done. I'm not letting them get away with this." David nodded, a slow grin forming on his face. "Then let's get to work." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of investigation and preparation. David and I worked tirelessly, digging through Langford's business dealings, Karen's actions in the HOA, and their connections to local officials. We quickly uncovered a network of influence that spanned far wider than I had imagined. Langford was connected to several shady land deals, and Karen had been using her position to collect bribes from residents, pressuring them into selling their properties for below-market prices. It was the perfect racket, people too afraid to speak out, too intimidated to fight back. But it wasn't just business. The two of them had also used their influence to control the local political landscape. Langford had deep ties to several local politicians who were either corrupt or too afraid to stand up to him. Karen had used her position in the HOA to drive certain residents out, taking control of properties that she could later profit from. They had created an ecosystem where power and money flowed freely, but only if you played by their rules. As we continued to dig deeper, I realized just how far-reaching their network was. But even though we had uncovered a mountain of evidence, there was still one question that lingered in my mind. Why had they targeted Sarah and me? David seemed to share my thoughts. "They don't usually target people like you, Lucas. You've got power, you've got connections. It's not adding up." I thought about that for a moment. It didn't make sense. Why would they go after us, especially when we hadn't been involved in anything that would make us enemies? But as I looked back at everything that had happened, the accident, the loss of the baby, the strange behavior of Karen and Langford, it started to become clear. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like they had seen us as a threat. I had recently become involved in a local legal case regarding property rights, one that had challenged some of the practices of the HOA. Sarah and I had been vocal about the need for reform in the neighborhood. We had started speaking out about Karen's manipulative tactics, and I had been pushing for a change in the way the HOA was run. We hadn't realized how deeply entrenched Karen and Langford were in the system, but they had certainly noticed us. It was then that I realized what had happened. They hadn't just hit Sarah because of an accident. They had targeted us because we had begun to stand up against them. We had become obstacles to their control, and for them, there's only one way to deal with people like us: silence. The weight of this realization hit me like a ton of bricks, but now that I knew their motive, I was more determined than ever to take them down. David and I spent the next few weeks meticulously collecting more evidence, reaching out to other residents who had been wronged by Karen and Langford, and speaking with legal experts who could help us build a solid case. We had all the pieces, and now it was time to put them together. But there was one thing I knew for sure: Karen and Langford's days of hiding behind their power were numbered. They had underestimated us, and they were about to pay the price for it. What began as a personal tragedy was now a fight against a system of corruption, a fight I wasn't going to lose. The courtrooms of the city were no strangers to intense legal battles, but none had ever felt as personal as this one. The case against Karen and Greg Langford wasn't just about legal procedure or the application of the law. It had become a war for justice, a battle against the very system of corruption they had built. I stood there at the front of it all, both a husband and a judge, tasked with ensuring that justice would be served, not only for Sarah, but for every person Karen and Langford had wronged over the years. As the case unfolded, Karen's arrogance grew. She had always thought she was untouchable, insulated by her connections and the network of influence she had cultivated over the years. She wore that confidence like armor in the courtroom, her posture rigid with defiance as she sat beside her attorney. Each time I glanced at her, I saw the same smirk, the same air of superiority she had shown from the beginning. To her, this was just another fight to win, another issue to manipulate for her own gain. But what she didn't know was that I was no ordinary judge. I wasn't just overseeing this case, I was a participant in a much larger plan, one that would force her to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how powerful she thought she was. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Karen's defense team had gone on the offensive, trying to cast doubt on the evidence we had painstakingly gathered. The footage from the parking lot, the testimonies of witnesses who had seen Karen leave Sarah for dead, the financial records linking Karen and Langford to the corrupt practices in the HOA, they all seemed to be dismissed as insignificant by her team. But I could see through the smoke and mirrors. I knew the truth, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The witnesses had taken the stand one by one, each of them adding another layer of evidence to the case. There was the store manager, Kevin, who had seen the aftermath of the accident and described Karen's lack of remorse. There was the woman who had been walking by when the accident occurred, who had seen the car speed off without hesitation. But it was the emotional testimony from Sarah's family and friends that struck the hardest blow. They spoke not only about the physical toll the accident had taken on Sarah, but the emotional damage she had endured. The grief of losing our baby, the trauma of being left alone in a parking lot, unconscious and vulnerable, by a woman who had no regard for human life. As the days dragged on, I could see Karen becoming more and more agitated. Her smirk had faded into a look of frustration, and her usual confidence had begun to crack. But it was her final cross-examination that revealed just how little she understood about the situation she was in. She had taken the stand herself, ready to defend her actions, to explain away everything she had done. But in her eyes, I could see the same arrogance. She still believed that she was above the law, that she could manipulate her way out of anything. "Mr. Whitaker," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "I didn't mean to hurt your wife. It was an accident, and I raised my hand to interrupt the weight of everything that had led to this moment crashing down on me. "No, Karen, You didn't just accidentally hit my wife. You left her there to die. You didn't even stop to check on her. And now, you're sitting here trying to manipulate this court into believing your lies. Your actions have consequences. She stiffened, clearly irritated by my interruption, but I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She wasn't prepared for the confrontation that was coming. She wasn't prepared for the truth to be laid out in front of her in such a stark, unforgiving light. Let's get something straight, Karen. I continued, my voice steady but filled with conviction. You've built your little empire on intimidation, on using your position in the HOA to manipulate people to crush those who dared to stand up to you. But you've made one fatal mistake. You underestimated the one thing you can't control, the law. The courtroom fell silent. The tension was palpable. Karen shifted in her seat, trying to maintain her composure, but I could see her beginning to falter. She knew that I wasn't just a judge. I was someone who understood the depths of the law and the lengths to which people like her would go to avoid accountability. She had underestimated my resolve, but what she didn't know was that I had been playing a long game. I stood up, slowly, deliberately, and walked over to the stack of evidence on the table. With each step, I could feel the weight of everything we had uncovered. The financial records, the surveillance footage, the witnesses. Everything pointed to Karen's guilt, but I had one final weapon. One final piece of evidence that would tie it all together and leave no doubt in anyone's mind that she was guilty. I reached for the final piece of evidence, a sealed envelope. The room held its breath as I opened it and pulled out the documents inside. As I turned to face Karen, I could see the color drain from her face. She knew what was coming. These documents, I said, holding them up for the court to see, are the key to understanding the true extent of your corruption. What you've done to my wife, to our unborn child, is bad enough. But what you've been doing behind the scenes, using your position to manipulate the real estate market, extort money from homeowners, and use your influence to control the local government, well, that's something far worse. The documents were the final piece of the puzzle. They were evidence of Karen's dealings with Greg Langford, the man who had been involved in orchestrating the accident, and several local politicians who had been complicit in their scheme. The papers outlined several illegal transactions, detailing how Karen and Langford had used the HOA's power to force residents to sell their homes for pennies on the dollar, only for the properties to be sold off to developers who would then pay them kickbacks. As I read through the documents, I could see Karen's face contort in horror. She knew she was finished. She had no way of explaining away the evidence. The truth was out, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. I don't care how many people you've bribed or how many lies you've told, I said, my voice cold with certainty. You're going down for this. Every last one of your crimes will be exposed, and you will pay for what you've done. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the gravity of the situation sank in. Karen's defense attorney stood up, sputtering in disbelief, but it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. There was no escape for her now. I turned back to Sarah's family, sitting in the front row, and nodded. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all the people Karen and Langford had hurt over the years. And with that final piece of evidence, I had done what I had set out to do. I had exposed the truth. No longer would Karen be able to hide behind her position, her connections, her wealth. The power she had once wielded with ease was now gone, and she would have to face the consequences of her actions. As I stood there, watching her crumble before the court, I knew one thing for sure. Justice had been served. The battle for justice has just begun, and the truth is finally out. Karen and Langford may have thought they were untouchable, but now they are facing the consequences of their actions. But this fight isn't over yet. There are still many more stories to be told. The system of corruption and greed that has been allowed to thrive in our communities must be exposed, and together we can bring it down. Stay tuned to the HOA stories for more shocking revelations, hidden truths, and powerful battles for justice. Subscribe, like, and share to ensure that these stories of corruption are heard and never forgotten. Your support means everything. Together, we can make a difference. Join us on this journey and be a part of the fight for justice. Tune in to the HOA stories, because the truth must be heard.